Are we good to get going then?
Sure.
Alrighty, Dr. Anderson, thank you for sitting down this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Trevor. My pleasure to be here.
You are a cardiologist by training in layman's terms, from what I understand, just to get a bit of background on yourself?
Yeah, that's right. So I've been at the University of Calgary and in Calgary as a practicing cardiologist for 25 years or so, Trevor. And my time is split between clinical care, about a quarter of the time, and then research. And then in the last little while, more administrative things, looking after previously the Department of Cardiac Sciences and the Libin Cardiovascular Institute. And in the last year, in a senior administrative role at the Cumming School of Medicine. So it's a nice mix of things and lots of education thrown in there.
That is very cool. So officially your title I'm reading here is Director of the Libin Cardiovascular Institute of Alberta. You are also a professor of cardiology at the U of C.
Yeah, so that was my previous title. So I'm a professor in cardiac sciences, but now I'm the vice dean of the Cumming School of Medicine. I was the previous director of the Libin Institute and the Department of Cardiac Sciences, and that honor now falls to my colleague Paul Fedak, over for that role from me about a year ago. And Paul's a cardiac surgeon and doing a great job running those two groups.
You are a really accomplished person. I was reading you also went to Harvard, I think, along with your med school degrees.
Yeah. So after my clinical training here, as my wife and I, we moved to Boston, and I did 3 years of research training there, which was great. Wow. And then, as I said, been back here for about 25 years, since 1995. So real thrilled to be here and contributing to the healthcare system. And Calgary is just a great place to be for a number of reasons in the healthcare sphere.
Well, I usually say when I talk to people, they're smarter than me on the subject we're talking about, but in this case, it's plainly obvious. So maybe I'll learn a thing or two.
Sure.
So you obviously you're into the mountains. Calgary was a big draw. That's one of the reasons why you ended up here. And were you always into the heart and cardiology? How did you get interested in that?
Yeah, hard to know. You know, I became interested in that in high school, and then undergraduate I was in science, and thought that was something I was interested in. And when I went to medical school, that was confirmed. And so I liked medicine. I liked the interaction with people. Cardiology was always something that was changing. Lots of technology, lots of research, lots of ability to help people acutely. And then, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is that there's great opportunities to prevent the number one killer of men and women in our country, coronary artery disease. And so that's what I've been focused on for a long time. So lots of great opportunities there, and Calgary is just a great place to do those things.
When you entered medical school, did you know you were going to be a cardiologist, or was it just kind of you enjoyed the subjects and were seeing where it went?
Yeah, no, I think it took a little bit of time to sort of realize that. I knew I didn't have the skill set or the aptitude to be a surgeon, and so I was drawn towards the internal medicine specialties, and cardiology was something I was always interested in and stayed interested in. And for a number of years of my career, we did procedurally based things where we put stents into people's arteries that were having heart attacks. So had a nice mix of both doing medicine and getting to do procedures on people, but not surgical. That's a very different skill set that I just don't have.
The level of training that you've received is probably quite a bit. How long did you have to spend in school and whatnot to get to where you're at?
Yeah, so, you know, medicine is a long haul. So you undergraduate work and then medical school and then residency training in medicine and cardiology and angioplasty, and then 3 years of research. So about 15 years in total, Trevor. And, you know, now the training is even longer. So lots of my colleagues, you know, don't start their medical career until they're in their mid-30s and have done lots of great things. So it's fun as you go along, and then it's great to start and then begin your independent career.
Did you ever worry that how are you going to pay the bills along the way when you're in your 20s and 30s and slugging it through school?
You get paid a little bit, as you know, once you finish medical school and you're a resident, then you get paid a little bit, not enough to pay off everybody's loans, but I lived at home and so didn't accrue a lot of debt. And students these days certainly have more debt than I had. And so that can be a bit of an issue, but you can at least sustain and buy food when you're a resident. Eventually you get a job, and then, you know, physicians in general are fairly well paid down the road. And so And unlike a lot of things these days, there's pretty good job security, and most people will get a job. So as I said, it's a great place to be.
But it's obviously not about the money. You were interested in the subject well beforehand, and you can't go into medicine for the money itself.
No, absolutely not. That's a very misguided approach, and people usually who have that motivation don't last because it's long hours and intense kind of work. And so people do it mainly because they like the pursuit of knowledge if they work at the university, and they like to apply that knowledge to teach the next generation of people. And then both of those things couple to provide excellent healthcare for the region or the city or the country. And so that's the motivation to do it. And a great academic coupling with healthcare provision is why Calgary has, a really outstanding healthcare system, because we have a university that creates new knowledge. So the Cumming School of Medicine, all the institutes associated with that do that. So that's the fun part of it, Trevor. That's why people are here, and that's why people stay here.
I think when people think of cardiology and doctors and whatnot, they kind of think of their family physician in the office, but your line of work is more studying and research?
Cardiology is a mixed bag of delivery of subspecialty and specialty care. So if a family doctor has a concern about a patient related to heart things, they'll refer them to a cardiologist who then sees them and assesses them. And I get to do that about a quarter or a third of my time. But then individuals, about half of the cardiologists in town, spend a lot of their time doing teaching and research. All of them teach, medical students and residents. And so that's the nice thing about being in Calgary. Everybody has that opportunity to do that. So some focus more on clinical and some focus more on the research. And then there's lots of people in between. But it's that nice mix that creates good systems of care and great outcomes for patients.
Do you ever get people asking you to be their doctor? I'm sure you get a lot of requests.
Yeah, so there's great cardiologists in town, but some people are attracted to certain personality types, etc. So I have a nice practice, and I've been here for 25 years. So people that I meet often are keen on staying with us, and that's the case for most of the cardiologists in town. Is that they provide great one-on-one care with great bedside manner for the most part, and people are pretty loyal and keen to work with them.
So getting back to the heart itself, as an expert in anything to do with the heart, what is the biggest misconception you generally hear about a healthy heart and on your way to health in general?
Yeah, I think, a few facts and figures, Trevor, are important to get put into context, is that there's lots of kinds of heart disease. The most common kind of heart disease that people think about are narrowing of the arteries that supply blood to the heart, so-called coronary artery disease. And that accounts for things that lead to heart attacks. And if you look at hardening of the arteries in the heart or in the brain that causes strokes, or in the peripheral blood vessels, that accounts for about 30% of all deaths in Canada. So it's still the leading cause of death for women, neck and neck with cancer for men, but is a really important healthcare utilizer of resources and takes a big toll on families. We've done a great job because we now know what the risk factors are. We can do great things on prevention and treatment for coronary artery disease. I think one of the biggest misconceptions would be is that this is mainly a disease of older men. This disease can occur at multiple ages. And as I said, it's now the leading cause of death for women. So women, as they get older, have an increased risk of heart disease. And because women outlive men by 7 or 8 years, is that overall heart disease kills more women than it does men. So it's not only a disease of men, it's a big deal for women, and women present slightly differently. So lots of work has been done at the Libin Institute and other places to kind of get rid of that misconception. The Heart and Stroke Foundation does a great job on advocacy, and their campaign last year was all about women and heart disease. So if I had to pick one, I'd say that would be a major misconception, that women, especially younger women, can't get heart disease, because they can. And so we want to do a lot of education around that so that they recognize that. And they worry about their risk factors. Women are great at looking after everyone but themselves, right? That's just kind of the way it goes. And what we want to do is for women particularly to look after themselves and their own risk factors.
So you obviously don't have all the answers as to why heart problems occur, but what are the main reasons you see
Sure.
arteries? Like, where's the problems? Why?
Yeah, if we're talking, lots of things, kinds of heart disease are because we're born with it, right? So there's a genetic predisposition for certain kinds of heart disease, congenital heart disease, some valvular heart disease. For coronary disease that leads to heart attacks, which is what we'll focus on a little bit, is that family history is important and genetics are there. But the major risk factors outside of family history are things that we can change or control. So relates to lifestyle, Trevor. And so we are a growing country with respect to the size of our waists. And so obesity and concomitantly decreased exercise output are a big risk factor, right? So we're getting larger. Because we have more fat around our middle, we have an increased risk of diabetes. So diabetes is a major risk factor. That coupled with that is that high blood pressure and high cholesterol are the other sort of two things that are in large part related to lifestyle and genetic factors as well. So, and then finally, cigarette smoking, which is the most horrible thing we can do to ourselves. And luckily that's decreasing over time, but still 15% of the people smoke, and that's a huge risk factor. So if you summarize those, family history, high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, and cigarette smoking are the big 5 sort of risk factors that we can work on. And then stress, lack of exercise, poor diet, lack of sleep, lack of aerobic exercise, all of those things kind of contribute as well. So the good news is that over the last 40 years, we've learned these things, and the risk of having your first heart attack is decreased by about 40%. But we still have a long way to go. Obviously, if 30% of the population die from this, we've got lots of things that we can still do. So those are the major things that people need to look at when they think about trying to improve their cardiovascular health going forward. And the old adage is never too early, never too late to do this. So young people like you who have a worry about their health can do those things, and living a healthy lifestyle is good. Or even in people who are older like me and have had a heart attack. I haven't had a heart attack, but people my age who have had heart attacks, they can then get on the bandwagon and prevent the next heart attack. And so that's all part of the prevention spectrum, which is great.
There isn't one particular cause that stands out for you?
No, there's lots of, all of those things can contribute to it. So for some people, it's a bad family history where they have a genetic disposition that gives them high cholesterol. For the next person, it's because they have high blood pressure. For the next person, it's because they smoke a package of cigarettes per day and they don't do any exercise. So it's variable. At a population level, if we can control all of those 5 risk factors, we can reduce the incidence of heart disease. So it kind of falls into 2 categories, Trevor. There's population and public health measures. So reducing the amount of sodium in food, that'll lower blood pressure by a couple of millimeters of mercury, that'll save thousands of lives. Exercise programs in purpose-built cities so that people can walk to places as opposed to taking a car everywhere. That would increase the number of steps in the whole population. That would decrease heart disease, and so on and so on. And then public health things with respect to having blood pressure measured and treated, measuring cholesterol, same with diabetes. So for the population, that's important. For the one-on-one person that comes to my office, then that's a detailed precision medicine approach where your fingerprint of risk is different than my fingerprint of risk, and we try to address those things the best we can. And it all starts with lifestyle interventions, right? Can you increase your exercise? Can you decrease your middle? Can you decrease your salt intake? And then for a lot of people, it involves medications to reduce those major risk factors: blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol. Those are super important things. So different for everybody, but at a population is that we can sort of evaluate all of those things and make interventions.
How important do you think sugar is to your diet and not over-consuming?
Yeah, so if I knew the perfect diet, then I would be rich and famous, Trevor. I could be Dr. Todd on, the Oprah show. And,
Right.
and if you go into a bookstore, it's amazing the myriad of books that here's the greatest diet known to man or woman that's going to decrease risk, right? So in general is that from a dietary point of view is that all of this literature was reviewed at a national level, and Canada's food guide came out a year ago, right? And so there's a food guide that basically advocates a fairly balanced diet. Sugar especially simple sugars, unprocessed, processed sugars, increase the number of calories you take in. And as a result of that is that it's fairly dense in calories, and unless you do a lot of exercise, the natural tendency is for you to gain weight. So that's the first thing. If you have a tendency for diabetes based on your family history, your ethnic origin, the amount of fat around your middle, is that simple sugars will not only increase the sugar level in your bloodstream, but will also increase one of the kinds of fats called triglycerides. They're converted to triglycerides. So that'll increase your risk of diabetes and increase your risk of forms of high cholesterol. So simple sugar in general doesn't fall into the you should eat a lot of it in Canada's health guide, in Canada's food guide, is that the current recommended diet is a balanced Mediterranean-like diet. You have a base of fruits and vegetables and grains and nuts and much less simple sugars and desserts, less meat, in terms of your protein. Plant-based diets in general are very healthy. Not advocating that everyone needs to be on a vegetarian or a vegan diet, but in general, a plant-based diet is a healthy thing to do with less, protein from animal fats as less of the components than there used to be. And that's generally good for the environment and also good for your cardiovascular health. So any people who are interested can go to just type in, Canada's food guide, and they can see, the recommendations and the pictures there.
You're not a dietitian, but what's the recommended daily sugar intake for the average adult?
Yeah, no, I'm not a dietitian, and my wife would, turn over in her office here if she knew that I was even talking about dietary.
Okay.
Because I'm not brilliant at that. So, generally is that, carbohydrate should be a smaller fraction of your diet. And so total amount of sugar is variable. And off the top of my head, I couldn't give you a number, but, that should be a decreasing amount in your diet. Sometimes the good way is just to look at food labels, right? So if you picked up a chocolate bar as an example, that has 140 calories, it'll tell you how much sugar is in there, and it'll give you sort of the percentage. So reading food labels is a good thing overall, and the Canada's Food Guide gives sort of exact numbers. But we kind of go away from, X number of grams of protein or X number of grams of sugar. It's really more of that kind of, can you get a balanced diet across the various food groups? And it's really more of the composition of the diet as opposed to trying to count that. For a while, we were obsessed in cardiology with you can only have so many grams of fat, right? And so therefore, if you have an egg, that's 80% of your total grams of fat. And then what we figured was that, and showed in research, that there wasn't a great correlation between the number of grams of fat you took in the cholesterol level in your blood or your risk overall. So, so it kind of went away from those kind of things, Trevor. So it's now more about just looking at the composition of things. But unfortunately, 70% of Canadians have a body mass index, which is a rough indication of how much fat we have. So only a third of the population are at ideal weight, higher if you're younger. But as we get older, that number seems to fall. So it is an important thing. And that's why the incidence of diabetes has doubled in the last 10 years. We've gone from 5% of the population having diabetes to now 10. So it's a big issue.
Well, I just Googled daily sugar intake, and the first Google hit was around 20 grams for women and 40 for men. But the reason I ask is because I'll eat these so-called health granola bars sometimes, and you'll read the recommended daily sugar intake on the back of the granola bar, and their recommendation will be, it'll account for, say, a quarter of your daily intake, but according to Google, that one granola bar will equate to maybe 40 or 50%, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so the food industry tends to underestimate what you sort of kind of need, right? Because they don't want you to read the label and say, wow, this is 100% of my daily intake of fat or sugar, etc. So yeah, going to a source in Canada's Food Guide is a good way to do it. But yeah, simple processed sugars, and it's not a lot, right? It's less than 40 grams, no matter what you sort of look at, which is, based on, a couple of hundred calories a day. So you have to sort of pay attention to these things. In general, is that, my usual advice to individuals is, if you can decrease the size of your portion, if you're overweight and you're concerned about decrease the size of your portions by 10% and increase your activity by 15 or 20 minutes a day, and you'll change that balance by 100 or 150 calories, and weight will come off at about a pound a month, and you can sort of work through that. So, you know, that's what we talk about with our patients in the clinic. But for some, you know, diets are important, and others need different kinds of intervention. But as I said, if I knew how to do this really well, is that I'd write a book and retire somewhere.
I mean, I just couldn't believe it. These so-called health bars, you know, they claim to have healthy characteristics, but then when you eat 2 or 3 of them, they're not healthy anymore.
Yeah, they're calorie dense kind of things. So
yeah,
a lot of those things are, you know, Cliff Bars and other things. If you're out climbing for 8 hours or out in the mountains hiking, you need, you burn a lot of calories and you're usually fine, right? If you're sedentary and have a couple of those a day, then you're going to, exceed the amount of calories that you burned, and it's going to be problematic. But in general, is that if you're really active, they can be a healthy choice in moderation.
How important do you think stress is to people's overall health and also heart health?
Yeah, it's a good question, Trevor. So we always talk about that, right? So, you know, there have been studies that have looked at individuals who've had heart attacks versus those who didn't, and then they did a questionnaire to look at how people respond to stressful situations. And so those individuals that tend to internalize, or so-called, you know, type A personalities where stress is an issue for them, they tended to have about 3-fold increased risk of heart disease. So it's important. It's probably as important as, you know, the major 5 risk factors that we talked about, like blood pressure and cholesterol. Not as important as diabetes or cigarette smoking, but clearly it plays a role, because not only does it wind people up a little bit, but the increase in adrenaline that circulates through their body, you know, increases their blood pressure, increases how they convert food into fat and sugar. And so it has an adverse effect. Again, easy to recognize in people. You know, you can recognize people that are pretty chill about things and others aren't. Harder to intervene, right? Is that in general, is that there is, you know, growing evidence in people that have a tendency towards anxiety or depression, is that cognitive behavioral therapy can sometimes be helpful. Sometimes simple things like yoga or meditation will sort of take down the level of stress a bit. And, you know, at our cardiac rehab program, which is amongst the best in the country over at the Repsol Center run by the Total Cardiology Group, is that they incorporate not only exercise into their rehab after a heart attack, diet and lifestyle and exercise, but stress management is a really important part of that program too, Trevor. And so they have psychologists that deal with that. And there's a small percentage of people where a psychology intervention to kind of help dealing with the external environment is key. Particularly important now during COVID. You know, it's stressful enough to have a heart event, but if you put it into the context of what's happening in the world and all of the stressors that people are feeling from, do I have a job? Is it safe to go out? Can I visit my grandchild? You know, all of those things have really added a lot to people's health and stressful dimensions, right? So it's really prevalent these days and important.
I mean, your job is probably pretty stressful, and getting through med school and all that is not easy. How did you deal with stress along the way?
You know, everyone deals with it in different ways. My usual way to deal with it was exercise, right? Yeah. So for me, getting out and exercising is a really great stress reliever and a good antidepressant for people. So I stress that a lot because that's my own personal bias. You know, these days, what we're finding, you know, for our medical students, because a lot of my work is at the university right now, right, is so how do you have students thrive in an environment where they're online for education, which is way harder than having face-to-face and having FaceTime. How to deal with the residents who are exposed to outbreaks in the hospital, as you see so much about right now. The poor Foothills is having a pretty significant outbreak, and so that has implications for our residents and our training, and they're redeployed to safer places, and some of them have been sick and some of them are waiting to know about their tests. So there's lots of stress that way. So we have lots of good psychosocial help in play at the university level. And so not only for our patients, but also for our trainees and our staff and the physicians who are struggling with that a little bit these days. So for me, it's one way, but for everyone, it's a little bit different, right, in terms of how they deal with things.
Did you ever have moments in med school or residency where you were a little overwhelmed, or you thought maybe you were going to turn around and this wasn't the right path for you or anything like that?
No, I never really had that. It was always very enjoyable. I think it was probably simpler 30 years ago, Trevor, when I trained. I'd like to think that that's the case. I think there's a lot, there's a lot more information available for trainees these days, right? You're expected to know everything because, as I said, I didn't know the answer to that question. You can just hit Google and an answer will appear, right? So now our students, instead of memorizing and knowing things in textbooks, know how to access it, right? So we are lucky that we have a lot of those kind of resources. On the other hand, patients come into the office and they expect that you'll know everything about everything, right? So it is pretty stressful for the trainees and the docs because it's an information technology that we live in, and people come in with handouts of, what do you mean you didn't read this last article that I just pulled off the internet last night, kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of that that adds to it. But no, for me, it was always very enjoyable. And, there's times when people are stressed, not to say I never had that, but didn't last for any great length of time so far, at least anyway, Trevor, knock on wood.
Speaking of technology and artificial intelligence and whatnot, how do you see that impacting cardiology and doctors and healthcare in general? Do you think it's moving towards a place of replacing doctors?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And so, our example that we've been talking about, coronary artery disease. So I told you that the chance of having your first heart attack now is 40% lower than 40 years ago. When I started medical school 30 plus years ago, if you had a heart attack, your chance of being dead at 30 days was 20%, 1 in 5. Now, if I had a heart attack this afternoon and my admin decided I was worthy of saving and called the paramedics, is that my chance of being dead in 30 days is 4%. So it's gone from 20% to 4%. That's all about many things, but technology plays a huge role there. We can open up arteries with stents immediately. We couldn't do that before. We have coronary care units staffed with highly skilled nurses and technologists. If something bad happens, they'll respond to it. We have medications that we never thought about, 30 years ago, and a plethora of things. All of those things really help. With respect to specifically about computing power, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, is that I think it's going to play a huge role, is that the things that can be done with so-called big data, right? And so we have lots of researchers at the university that are doing that. We're investing heavily in this domain. So, a patient now may have terabytes of information about them, their physiological data, beat-to-beat heart rate, wearable technologies, all of the imaging that they've had, all of the lab work, all of the drugs. You can put it all together in this big data format for a single patient. And then if you put millions of patients together, which we can do in Alberta, one of the advantages of Alberta Health Services is it's a single healthcare delivery system where we have access in an anonymized and safe way for researchers to look at that data to do predictive analytics, right? So why do people develop heart attacks? And so we can look at way more data than we had before. For imaging, I think the place that the machine learning, so machine learning is important there. So we take all of this data and then we can apply machine learning algorithms as opposed to simple statistics that we used to do to predict things, right? And so that's the case. The other place it's going to be is going to be in image evaluation and interpretation. So if you take a cross-sectional image from an X-ray as a CAT scan or an MRI, and you apply that to an algorithm, is that there's algorithms that are built that will read that for you and point out more abnormalities than a radiologist could probably find, right? So I think it won't be a stretch that in 5 years is that a lot of that work will be augmented, not replaced, Trevor, right? So I'd like to show me this app is that if you Google jobs that can be replaced by a computer, is that a lot of the machine learning stuff will come up there, right? So he wants to be a pilot. So a pilot, 60% of that can be replaced by the computer. Radiologists or cardiologists that reads images, 40% of that can be replaced. So I think what'll happen is that the people will be doing the face-to-face work. They will be applying the art of medicine, but the actual nitty-gritty of things will be replaced by that. And diagnosticians as examples, so somebody comes in with X, Y, and Z symptoms, as a physician, I would need to know what are the things that can do that. Well, now I can either Google that, or you can use, IBM Watson, who could then spit out, 10,000 diagnoses, and the most likely one based on the area you live in and the age of the patient and all these other risk factors. So a lot of that is going to be replacing what we do. Our job will be to synthesize all that information, be the interface with the patient. So we'll see a lot more of that. So I think it's exciting times. I think that, the amount of money that we put into this is going to be large. Lots of research computing power has gone into that. The province is investing with Alberta Health Services in an information management system for all of the data in all of the hospitals called EPIC that will pull all this data together. So we're going to be able to do lots of things. And that has important ramifications, not only for diagnosis and treatment, but also best use of healthcare resources, right? Is that we can't keep dumping half of our GDP from the province into healthcare. And if the government gave us all of the GDP, all of the budget, is that we would spend it because so what we need to do is to be more nimble and to be a little bit more flexible and use cues from health information systems and big data to decide what test is useful and what test isn't, so that we don't spend money needlessly on things, and that we can provide the dollars where they're best utilized, new technologies, new drugs, new et cetera, et cetera. So that's a great question. And I think, like other industries, unless we're open to it, is that we'll get left behind. But medicine is changing quickly, and there's a lot of information that's available. And, basically we spend a lot of time at our computers doing things. So.
One of the critiques of AI is that it relies on the big data dump and therefore takes out the creativity of the human mind. How important do you think that aspect of medicine is to solving problems in cardiology?
Yeah, I think it's huge. So a lot of the AI algorithms are built by creative scientists, and it's not only physicians. A lot of it is by biomedical engineers and physicists and nurses and all individuals. So on the front end is that there's a lot of creativity that goes into it. And then once the data is dumped into it, and the output that comes out of these things is that then it needs to be filtered by somebody who would say, okay, well, you've listed 12 diagnoses here, but the last 6 I've never seen in my career or just don't exist in this population. So there's a lot of creativity that is needed there in terms of interpreting it, right? So I think it'll be a combination of efforts that we will rely on that, but we will need the experience of clinicians that have or scientists to do that. And it'll be ever changing and ever evolving, and there'll be a lot of input that goes into the algorithms that will make things terrific. So I thought medicine was really exciting 30 years ago when I started, Trevor, but it's amazing now. And I have some of my colleagues that are, at retirement age and don't want to retire because they just see what the future looks like now compared to what they had to work with. And so it's a marvelous time. And, that link with computational analyses and engineering is amazing.
How important do you think creativity is to medicine? I mean, you kind of blend art and science at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, I think it is good. The very best clinicians, what people identify as, who's a good doctor, right? And especially, for the coalface, for the one-on-one interaction with the patient, is that creativity, bedside manner, communication skills are all super important. That changed from 50 years ago when, the doctor made a house call with his little bag because they had no tests or anything else to do. That is still super important for the patient one-on-one. If you ask, their patient what they want to see in their doctor, is that, they want the doctor to be competent, but they want somebody that they can communicate with, that's going to have empathy and reach out to them. So that remains super important. At a larger level than at the university level or at the health authority or at the Ministry of Health, the medical officer of health, et cetera, then you need to be thinking big picture. What's best for the population? What are the systems of care we need to put into all of those things? And their creativity is even more important. At a university level, is that you can teach a lot of people with good bedside manner to be good clinicians one-on-one, but for somebody to nimbly change the direction of the healthcare system, where the university is going to go in terms of how we're going to prioritize research things at the university and at the medical school, is you need very creative people there. So that those tend to be the trainees, the PhD students, the postdoctoral fellows that gravitate towards a career in health and science. And so that's where the creative minds tend to be. Not to say clinicians aren't, lots of them are very creative, but these are individuals that are looking to creatively solve problems, right? So how do I make healthcare better 10 years from now because of the research we're going to do now? How am I going to pass that knowledge along to my grad students so that they can then do something even better than me? So creativity is really the hallmark of what a university does, right? That's where the smart people are, and it's not book smart, it's creativity.
Yeah.
Putting all these people together is really what you want to do. You want interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary people that have expertise in medicine and engineering, et cetera. And that's the very brightest people who can combine all those things. They have the skill set to engineer something, but they see the big picture of what the end game is and how do we make that better for an individual. So yeah, I think you're right on tact there, is that that's key.
Do you ever read Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner?
I haven't, but I know of some of the thoughts there, right? So
mental models and how you're supposed to take a little bit from each discipline. And
yeah, we talk about that a lot in training. You know, the old training used to be, well, somebody trained and they knew a lot about one discipline, you know, whether biology or physics or chemistry or engineering, etc. Now the individuals that are going to do the great things and who are going to be best prepared for the future are those that can take a little bit out of each of those silos, Trevor, right? And we haven't done a great job of that yet. Everyone talks about wanting to train the multidisciplinary student or professor or clinician, but it is really hard to do that. The training is long enough, right? I mean, I told you I trained for 15 years in one specific area, and now we're asking people to say, well, could you just tack another 5 years on so you can learn about X, Y, or Z on top of that? And that's where the dilemma goes. But if we set up our training programs in undergrad and graduate school to take a little bit out of each of those, then we're going to create good things. And that's where the university, you know, wants to put like-minded people together to solve problems, but from different disciplines. And we have 7 research institutes within the medical school. One of them is the Libin Institute, and so we try and take people from about half a dozen different faculties and different departments who are all interested in maybe heart health research. Doesn't matter if you're a nurse or an engineer or a social worker or a medical student, etc. You're interested in the same end game, but you bring a different skill set. Put them all together, get students to work with all of those people. That's kind of the mix. That's
right.
The secret.
I think his quote is, the man with a hammer, every problem looks the same. And so the worry is that you get someone who's super specialized in one field and then they try and apply that knowledge to all different sets of problems. Do you ever worry about that with your students?
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. And so that's why, you know, the training has become longer, because we've tried to expose people to different views. For our cardiology trainees, it's great in Calgary because, you know, there's 100 cardiologists, half of them are in private practice, mainly doing clinical work. They have a different perspective on things than somebody who's a subspecialist doing research. And the student can then, you know, gain knowledge from all of them, right? And so hopefully then they can adapt their own style to it, but you got to expose them to a large variety of different opinions. And that's why we always like people who have trained at different institutions, right? So a lot of the medical students did their undergrad somewhere else and then they do their residency somewhere else, because we can become pretty insular and think, hey, this is the only way to do it, is the way we do in Calgary. So we love it when people have trained and come from elsewhere and say, why didn't you think about doing this? Why don't we do this in a different way, right? And so that's the real importance of training in different locations. And so can't overemphasize that enough. That is really great.
Do you ever worry in academia and at universities that departments kind of get trapped in their own silos and that they don't work together just based on the nature of the system? Again, that's one of Charlie Munger's critiques of academia, is that everyone kind of gets trapped in their own silo.
Yeah, I think it's, it certainly can happen, and it's something we're always watching out for, right? And so in my new role, as I have 20 departments that report to me, and so I came from, spending 15 years in one department, right? I was in the Department of Cardiac Sciences and ran it, made a certain way of doing it, and you do and collaborate with people. Now what I see is the best of all of the different departments and the worst, and you get to then say, well, maybe this should work. And so when I meet with those department heads, you can sort of hopefully see what they're doing, take the best of that, and maybe scale it to other areas. I think we're better at collaborating because you have to do that now. In research, it used to be you could be a lone researcher in one place and sit in your basement, but now collaboration is everything. And so we've done a good job over the last 20 years of that, Trevor, is that our researchers interact globally, they collaborate internationally, and they share information very quickly. So you can't be a bubble or an island anymore. You have to be working with people that bring the best. They have the best mouse model, they have the best drug, they have the best X, and it doesn't matter where they are. And particularly during COVID, when everything is virtual anyway, you don't actually need to go and meet with them. They don't need to sit with you. Cannot overestimate how important it is to have, impromptu meetings with people one-on-one that are in the same building as you, but we can do this by Zoom, right? And people are doing that, especially in the last 6 months, where they'll organize a Zoom call and they'll bounce ideas off each other. And it's like, yeah, I'm doing that, but this didn't work. Why don't you try that? And that way people don't waste a lot of time doing it. So yeah, the siloed approach is always a concern. We always have to watch out for it, but I think we're beating down those barriers.
It's almost like certain profs try and protect their turf, and they're kind of like they're tenured or whatever, and they don't want to step outside the boundaries to go talk to different, I guess, physics and biology and psychology. Do you know what I mean? That's the critique. Yeah. How do you get around that?
Yeah, I think that used to be more. It used to be is, you had to publish a certain amount, get promoted, you had to be competitive with your person down the hall or in another department or faculty. I think there's less of that now. We've, our criteria for promotion and for merit increases, et cetera, has changed. It used to be you had to be the first or the last author on a paper. Now people recognize that maybe there's going to be 20 authors on that paper, and even though you're author number 4, is that was an important contribution, because the only way you got to publish in the very best journal is by having 20 people on your paper. So, what I'd rather see is somebody doing that and being in the top tier journal, or getting a research grant, as opposed to somebody who worked by themselves, didn't have the bandwidth to do the research because they didn't have collaborators or partners, and therefore that work wasn't recognized in as prestigious a place. And so I think we've gotten over that from that mindset. Some of the senior professors don't see that. The young people see that. We communicate differently. We work together on social media. They do a lot of different things, and the university and the health region recognize different things. Group care is important for people with complex problems, and getting a bunch of different clinicians together. Nobody has an ego about, hey, I couldn't figure out this problem, I need to call in some help, and because people have that expertise. So we're getting better, but you're right. I think that it's something
it's not me. It's not.
No, I understand, but it's, experts are right that, some of those things are still out there in some academic institutions, and we need to improve upon that. But we're heading in the right direction.
Another quote I read the other day was from Nassim Taleb, and his critique of academia was that it's a zero-sum game. And the quote is, every position and honor, promotion, rank, reward is taken from someone else instead of creating mutual value. How do you avoid that scenario with your students?
Yeah, there is a little bit of that, and more of that. We've been in a nice position over the last decade where we've been able to actually grow the pool, right? And so the number of full-time faculty positions has grown by about 20%. So new money has been brought into the system, either through government or through granting agencies. So we've actually been able to improve that. So it wasn't a zero-sum game, is that we didn't have to wait for someone to retire, or my increase in merit was because you got less kind of thing, is that we were able to do that. I think now, over the next few years, is that because of budget constraints, and let's face it, is that academia and the healthcare system is provided mainly by the provincial government, is that there's going to be no new money, and we're going to have to shrink budgets a little bit. But what we need to do, Trevor, is that, in the healthcare system, we need to be more efficient at using the money we have. So if we need another $1 million in cardiology, that's not taken, from pediatrics, as an example, right? So, but let's reallocate the money that we have so that everyone's a winner, so that the patients aren't exposed to things that are of low value for them and potentially dangerous, so that we can do good things. On the university side, is that if we have no new positions for professors or new grad students, et cetera, how do we make the most of that? Well, we look for partnerships, right? So we need to, the new strategic plan of our, new president. Okay, so we have a new president, Ollie, and so has a strategic plan going forward of growth through focus. And even despite troubled financial times, we want to grow the University of Calgary. We want to increase the number of grad students by 3,000. We want to increase the number of highly qualified personnel. We do that through partnerships with industry, with the health authority, with technology companies, whoever, right? So we want to be value add the city. So we want to be indispensable to those partners. That's the first thing. And then we utilize the resources that we have, right? So if we want to grow faculty positions, how do we convince people that maybe it's time for them to move on or do something else so that a young person can get a job, kind of thing. And we've been successful for people doing that in a respectful way. But I think the partnership piece is going to be really important so that we can grow those relationships, so that we can grow despite a time when others might think, gee, we should be contracting. Maybe we should have less professors, or we should have less grad students. In fact, we want to have more grad students because that's the engine of what's happening at the university. It's the youth that are going to, it's the students that drive innovation. They're the ones with the ideas. And then how do we, work to create new startup companies? Lots of ideas in health, lots of great ideas at the university. So how do we create that entrepreneurial pathway so that you can take your idea out of your lab, form a small startup, attract venture capital dollars, and do all of those things. So that's cool. Health, I think, to try and move those things along. So, there'll be some turbulent times, and we're not just going to turtle down and buckle down and see what happens. Is that we want to look for those opportunities to kind of grow and expand where we can. And I think we'll be successful in doing that if we keep our eye on the game.
You're not a politician. I won't make you give predictions or anything like that, but do you think there's a room for kind of a two-tiered system in Alberta where the private industry is encouraged to take risks and develop, like you're saying?
Yeah, I think more of my conversation in the private industry related to the university, right, is so that, you'd like companies to put in dollars to fund new technology to make it easier to do healthcare. So, for-profit business, it's, it's kind of like talking about religion or politics.
Yeah.
Two-tiered healthcare system creates very polar opinions, right?
Yeah, I won't make you get into it, but.
Yeah, I don't want to get into it in great detail. The reality is that Canada's healthcare system is revered by Canadians in general because we tend to have universal healthcare. That is something that we pay taxes for, and people live and die, and people live here because of that. The two-tiered system in the United States is problematic. They spend way more as a percentage of their GDP on healthcare than we do in Canada. Canada's still expensive, but there are those that believe that the only way out of this is to create some partial two-tier to it. I think that lots of people could be supportive of that as long as it doesn't dilute the public system. That's been the concern, right? Is that if you make people pay for healthcare, is that you increase the divide that we already have with, equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is a big important thing for us at the university and the healthcare system for a variety of reasons. But COVID has done that, right? The people that are getting COVID tend to be individuals of lower socioeconomic status and minorities because they don't have the luxury of working from home because their jobs are such that they have to go.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
A two-tiered system has the risk of increasing that. So if I have money and I want to pay for an MRI, I can still do that in Calgary tomorrow. But if you add to the list of those things, I can get my hip replaced because I have money to do it, makes people uneasy. And as you may have read, that was just shot down in a landmark case in British Columbia at the Cambie Clinic, where they've been lobbying to have two-tiered system that people could come and get paid for. That was shot down by the government. So there's, by the legal system. So there's still some concern there. At the end of the day, is that unless we change, is that it's hard for the public purse to pay for this. Maybe the way to go is for us to, be paying for healthcare premiums again, like we used to years ago. But there's probably some parts of this that are reasonable to privatize. There are some parts that may be reasonable for people to pay for, but it's a double-edged sword, and people feel pretty passionately about it. So if I had to predict, I think we will move along those lines very slowly, very carefully, and some people will hate it, and other people will think we're going too slow.
I mean, yeah, I guess it's the balance between encouraging, the entrepreneurs. Like, what if you had an idea tomorrow and you could be a
Yeah.
billionaire? I'm sure you've had ideas along the way, and
Yeah, and I think we haven't done a good job at that. I think scientists now, particularly the university, or even those that are doing healthcare, are thinking about how can I use this for a great idea, and
yeah,
have to involve an end game where we have a two-tiered healthcare system. It can be, how can we sell this software, that analyzes cardiac imaging data to a vendor? And we've done that. There's a company in town called Circle that did that 15 years ago. They had a great idea for software. Now there's 190 engineers working for them, and they provide software solutions throughout the world. One example, there's tons of those where good things occur. And this is clinicians with great ideas, or working with scientists and biomedical engineers to put all these things together, Trevor. So yeah, it's that collaborative spirit, and entrepreneurial thinking is not a bad idea. I think it's going to help us with partnerships to, in fact, pay for that. Wouldn't it be great to have a company that's trying to develop things that wanted to help support and pay for professors and pay for students and pay for part of the healthcare? At the end of the day, is that they will create a product that will be beneficial for humankind with respect to how we provide healthcare, make money down the road, but at the same time give back to the community and the university where people are developing these ideas. So lots of that's going on. And I think we can partner with the city as well for lots of things to help them on their mission to creating the healthiest city. That's what Calgary, like every other city, wants. We want to be the healthiest city. We want to be the greenest city. Let the university and the healthcare system help you with that, and they're starting to do that.
One of the critiques of a private healthcare system and big companies in, like, say, big pharma, is that their interests aren't always aligned with your health. So what's your opinion on things like over prescribing and opioids and all that? Do you think that's happening more and more?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think big pharma, gets a bad rap, and I think probably deserved it 20 years ago in terms of, they would jockey for position with care providers, with health authorities, et cetera, and they had big dollars to invest, and they got very rich doing that.
But
On the other hand, is that without that investment, the government can't afford those studies that are being done. It takes about $1 billion to bring a drug to market these days. And so companies take a risk, and about 1 in 10 of them, only about 1 in 10 ever make it to market. So companies are spending billions of dollars for nothing, right? Zero return. So they're a business. I have great respect now for partnerships that we have with big pharmaceutical companies, big technology companies, imaging companies, et cetera. They are very vested in working as true and genuine partners. They need to make money at the end of the day. They have shareholders, don't get me wrong, but I think most of them are pretty reasonable with respect to the ethics that they have around this. The conflict of interest is very well defined and controlled, both at the university level for the professors and at the company level. And so they're very important partners for us. And so I think that will continue to do things. Most of the drugs that we have right now, Trevor, are generic, right? And so in my world, cardiology, we dole out lots of drugs and, blockbusting drugs that have reduced risk, where companies made lots of money, and some of the patients still come to me and say, you're just prescribing this so that the company can make more, or they're paying for your research.
That's the urban legend, right? Yeah.
But the reality is that the vast majority of these are now generic, and they cost, billions of dollars went into this, and now you can buy this drug for $10 a month, and it reduces your risk of heart disease by 1/3, right? So don't be bitter about that, is that the company made their money over the years, but now we reap the benefits of all of that technology. These things wouldn't have happened without that. So I'm pretty sympathetic to that. And, as long as conflict is managed reasonably, is that there's lots of opportunity for researchers to then have great ideas, to work with pharma, to develop them. Because, if you are developing a drug to treat condition X, call it diabetes, you don't have, you may be able to get millions of dollars in grants to develop it, to do the science, et cetera. Your lab or the university doesn't have hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to take it to the next step. It's a natural partnership to hand that off and to work with that. And companies are good about working with the universities around that. And the very best universities have great relationships and great, affiliation agreements with large pharma, with technology companies and spin-offs, et cetera. So it's not just pharmaceuticals. Now, I think, as you said, it's going to be the machine learning companies. It's going to be the technology companies that are going to be super insightful. So.
Do you ever worry about maybe what we'll look back on in 100 years and say, maybe we shouldn't have given people this many drugs, and like we don't know what we don't know and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's been mistakes along the way, right? There's been certain drugs that have had sort of devastating side effects. You know, thalidomide is the best example. Here's a nausea for women in pregnancy that, you know, wasn't fully vetted in terms of its teratogenicity and caused trouble. The reality, though, now, Trevor, is that certainly in my field is that the reason your chance of having dying from a heart attack or ending up in the hospital with heart failure compared to 30 years ago is because I now have you on 4 or 5 drugs, and the risk is dramatically reduced, right? So some people have side effects from them, but they tend not to be lasting things, and people live longer and feel better. So I'm often encounter, you know, hardcore patients that say, well, this drug has too many side effects. And sometimes my response to them is, well, the side effect of not taking this drug is death. Or the side effect for you is ending up in the hospital or feeling terrible. I'm not going to force you to take this medication, but a lot of the medications, you know, are very, very effective. So it's kind of the world that I live in, so I don't feel badly about that. And for some people, they do have side effects, and we sort of push things off and stop them, et cetera. But in general, a lot of the gains have been made because of the positive effects of these. And if somebody wants to feel better and live longer, then great. We have options for you. If you don't want to, and you know, don't like taking that, I have lots of patients who would rather not take medications. We'll try and do things naturally. And for them, that's a conscious choice that they make, right? And so all we can do is advise. So no, in general, I don't ascribe to the theory that we're overdoing it in certain areas, but we do need to be careful. And that's always the worry about trying to rush a vaccine out, right? For COVID, as an example, is that we could make a mistake in terms of the safety stuff. Most drugs are incredibly well tested for years and years and years to make sure that there's not even the 1 in 1,000 side effect. And you just have to balance speed with what our appetite is for risk, right? And so I think at the moment, because of the impact of COVID, is that people have an appetite such that if it looks quasi-safe, we'll learn about it more, let's roll it out, as opposed to let's do 10 years of studies to make sure that it's going to be 100% safe. So it's that balance.
Isn't the first rule of medicine do no harm?
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. So that's generally why things are tested, and it costs $1 billion to roll out a new drug or a new technology or a new stent or a new pacemaker, because we test the heck out of it, right? We test and we test and we test and we look for everything. And even after it's approved, you know, because Health Canada is a pretty conservative group of people, even after it's approved, is that we do post-marketing surveillance on this, so that if you have a side effect that's, you know, even 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 50,000 and occurs 5 years later, we can track that. So that is the adage of medicine, isn't it? Is first do no harm. But, you know, you've seen with people that have life-threatening metastatic cancer where there's no treatment, they'll roll out drugs earlier for that because people will want to take that chance. Don't care if the side effect is high, or people will have super high risk surgery because they're looking for that. Now with COVID, is that because of the devastation that it's caused in so many ways, is that there will be debate in terms of when's the right time to kind of roll it out, right? So, you know, I hope it's not one of those Will Smith movies where the vaccine or the cure for cancer causes zombieism or something, but I don't think so. But, you know, whether we'll get it right or wrong, only time will tell, Trevor. But I think that there's just such a need and an appetite to roll out something as quickly as we can for the sake of people's health, the economy, isolation, all of those things, that we will see some shortcuts there. Most of the time that's going to be fine, but we'll see.
Your world isn't easy, but in some ways the options for medication is life or death with your patients. Do you ever worry about things like PTSD and something like ADD, where the prescriptions, the options aren't as black and white? There's a lot of fallout on the side effects in those scenarios.
Yeah, so it's not an area I know well with respect to the medications. certainly there are some medications in my world that are higher risk, and we have long conversations about it for people. Things that are softer with respect to the benefits and that risk-benefit ratio, we have longer conversations about. But you're right, there are other conditions where the medicines aren't as well tested, and the side effects may be higher. And so, my psychiatry colleagues deal with that a lot with some of their medications.
Yeah.
Some are very well established, others aren't. And sometimes we have docs that overprescribe medications. You alluded earlier to pain medications, so we have a narcotic, epidemic in our country of narcotic deaths, and people think, well, it's drug users and it's people that are, shooting up on the street. Well, a good chunk of those deaths are from prescription drugs where, they were given for a soft indication, or they weren't stopped, or, we didn't have that hard conversation with the patient, or the patient didn't have that hard withdrawal kind of thing. And then it ends up with something happens for whatever reason. And so we worry about that a lot. And I think the good news is that the College of Physicians and Surgeons keeps track on that a lot. Now I get a report card every 6 months. How many sleeping pills did one prescribe? How many narcotics did you prescribe? So that there is an audit and feedback there that we can keep track of that, because we have to. It's just part of the surveillance that we have to try and decrease this opioid crisis that's out there. It occurs at all levels. Some of it is prescription, and we just need to do a better job with some of those kinds of things.
It just seems like matters of the brain are so much harder to quantifiably track. You know what I mean? Like AED.
Yeah, for sure. The outcomes are different, right? The metrics in my world are pretty easy.
Not easy.
Well, easy-ish. Your blood pressure is high. I'm going to give you a medication. You can check it at home and tell me what it is. It's pretty quantifiable, right? And whereas other things in terms of quality of life and brain and mental health is a little bit more subjective. And that's why, brain and mental health is a priority of the health authority. It's one of the priorities of the university as well, because it takes such a big toll on people. And it's a little more black, it's a little grayer and with respect to, are we doing a good job or not? So, and then, as you tie in addictions there into the mental health thing, is that it's become problematic. And then, gosh, if you throw in the equity, diversity, inclusion, and the whole Black Lives Matter movement of inequalities there, that lead to devastating outcomes, is that it creates a interesting fabric of opportunity. And so it's something we're paying a lot of attention to at the University, Trevor, as are other universities, that we need to do a better job in that domain, and we will work hard to do that.
Where do you see the biggest advancements in medicine coming from in the next little while? Is it AI and software? Is it things like PTSD and alternative remedies and stuff like that? Or
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the technology will clearly drive things, so for good or bad, but it will make life easier. It will make life more complicated for the learner, but for the patient at the end of the day, is that if used appropriately, it's going to be very helpful. So it's already resulted in an increase in longevity, increased quality of life, new drugs for diseases that didn't used to be curable, certain kinds of cancers, certain heart disease that we have, certain viral infections. HIV, when I was a medical student, was a death knell, death diagnosis. Now people live pretty reasonable lives with it. Hepatitis C, we have treatments that actually cure it instead of going on to develop cirrhosis and death. So lots of good examples of that. So I think technology will certainly drive it. We will certainly need to continue to utilize resources to the best way that we can, figure out that interaction between technology and the science of medicine in terms of providing patients with what they want, keeping patients in their home as opposed to going to see a variety of subspecialists, et cetera. In fact, one of the benefits of COVID has been I do a lot of Zoom calls with my patients, right? So instead of patient driving from Medicine Hat to see me, is that I can do a Zoom call with them for half an hour. So their visit is a half an hour instead of 8 hours, right? And yeah, sometimes I do need to lay my stethoscope on them and listen, but a lot of times we can do things without doing that. So I think there'll be some advantages there with remote telehealth and other things from a medicine point of view. And then trying to shift the model from acute care delivery to prevention and chronic care is going to be important. Be great if we only needed half the number of emergency beds, half the number of hospital beds, because people could have a place to go. They didn't have to go to the emergency room for things that they're worried about but aren't really that worrisome. And that we can then utilize those beds for other things. And I think we'll get there with time. The whole focus on primary care, patient-centered care in the family, in the patient home is something that that our primary care colleagues are working on a lot, and I think will be a big advance in medicine. And then finally is that, you know, training the next generation of people that will want to work in rural areas and fixing the inequities of things, of having good representation from Indigenous scholars, from Black scholars, from other minority groups, etc., that we don't have the kinds of things that you see erupting in the US. And, you know, the systemic racism is a deal everywhere. It's a deal in Canada, right? We don't want to admit that, but it's just as much as a deal here, and something that we're working on. So I'd like to see those kinds of social accountability aspects as a progress point for us, Trevor, moving forward. It's easy to say on technology, but it's the softer stuff that is really important to a lot of people, and we want to get that right too. So I see that as a big advance, and sometimes that's harder to do than an engineer inventing a faster, greater machine. Those other things are tough. If social accountability was easy, we wouldn't have the nonsense that we see in our world. So that, I think, is where the big advance will come.
Speaking of indigenous scholars and whatnot, do you see much opportunity in sort of alternative medicines at all? Or like, I was reading a study the other day, it was on PTSD and the use of psilocybin and some of these alternative therapies. Do you see much opportunity in that field?
Yeah, again, outside of my sphere of expertise, for sure. I mean, there's lots of things that are deemed to be alternative or care that we don't know anything about, right?
Yeah.
Hasn't been exposed to a large randomized trial, so we don't know whether it works or not. We know whether it's safe or not. And so sometimes that's the best I can tell patients, is to say, I'm okay with you taking this in addition to the medicines I know that work for you. There are a lot of things that are naturopathic kind of things that we have tested in trials that don't work, yet people still think it's better to take something natural than something that's prescribed by big pharma, right? So there's a lot of that. But that's more of the minority of things. You know, lots of the vitamins that people take have been shown in big trials not to do anything, you know. Well, yet people still take a handful of them. They complain about the costs of their medications, but when you add up what the cost of their vitamins are, it costs way more than the $10 a month for the prescription medication. Alternative therapies, especially in the brain and mental health area, I think are to be studied, right? So there's lots of new things that we need to look at. You know, there's lots of growing areas in the, you know, nutraceutical areas, right? So the gut microbiome is a big deal, Trevor. You know, the trillions of organisms that live in our gut that process things that lead to diseases that we are just beginning to understand, whether it's GI diseases or brain and mental health or cardiac, and ways to influence that, not by medication, by what you take in. I think that's a big area of growth and focus kind of going forward. And we have a germ-free facility at the university here at the school, and lots of microbiome work is kind of going. I think that's a really exciting area as well. And that fits kind of nicely into your concept of alternate therapies, et cetera. And we just need to understand the mechanism, right? There's lots of things that probably work out there that we don't understand, but we can get at the mechanism of that and then decide what the goods and the bads of that are. So I think there'll be lots of things that will happen in that domain as well.
Do you ever have to encourage your students to kind of think outside the box and remember that there's, like, you know, some of the best ideas come from these like other disciplines? Because I remember, like, in university, you get so caught up in like just trying to pass tests. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a bit of that, right? And so getting into grad school or getting into medical school is still competitive, right?
Yeah.
Students are still chasing grades. I think the undergrad programs do a better job of entrepreneurial thinking and thinking outside of the box and putting different people together. Is it as good as it could be? No, but it is improving in that domain. Within medical school, the nice thing at Calgary is that the medical students, they don't get grades, and so they collaborate a lot with each other. It's pass-fail, and there's lots of things that are happening with alternative types of education, rural education, social accountability, entrepreneurial, all of these things. engineering and medicine. So, we're trying to incorporate those things into the medical school curriculum here. But still ways to go on that. But you're right, sometimes students will get bogged down in their own little world, right? It's like, I got to learn this biochemical pathway, and that's all I'm thinking about. And that's where sort of a Renaissance education and having a couple of supervisors and having multiple people on graduate committee, different ideas come to it. Back to our previous idea of the more ideas you can expose people to, you can get them out of their bubble. Some are good at this, some are not. But it's the creative people that you talked about earlier that are going to be the ones that will do that the best, and that will be able to look outside of the box. And we need to do that. We need to look outside of the box to move forward.
Like, I was reading about LSD. I'm not a big LSD guy or fan or anything like that, but for instance, it was legal for a super long time, and now they're, I guess, researching that maybe it is helpful because the compound itself can be used to treat the brain or something.
Yeah, so I think there is work in that domain. Again, not a literature that I keep up with. But,
just an example,
Yeah, the interplay between psychiatry and neuroscience and neurology and brain health is really fascinating. And a lot of these compounds that are neurotransmitters that have recreational use for some people, may be used as therapeutics for others. And, it gets at the whole thing of, legalization of cannabis, right? I've got lots of patients on CBD oil for pain and for sleeping. Some people throw THC in there as the active ingredient, hallucinogenic ingredient in marijuana that we're just learning about, right? And so studies are underway to try and figure out, is it useful? And if it's useful, in what diseases? And what are the outcomes to sort of be measured? So I think lots of opportunity there, but not a ton of data so far. Yeah.
Well, I won't take too much more of your time. I really appreciate this. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for all the questions. You're well prepared and ask great questions. So thanks for asking me to have conversations.
I go one more for you. Do you ever worry about overpopulation and that all our efforts are kind of leading to too many humans? Yeah, that's a pretty macro question.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Is that there's a group of people that worry about that, right? Is that if you look at the growth, that at some point we will outstrip our natural resources, even if we get really good at not using petroleum products and we're good at wind and solar, is that we just won't be able to generate enough food for people. So there's a lot of prominent people that worry about that. I haven't paid a lot of attention to it, honestly, because I haven't read around it, but I don't know. It's there is a finite number of people that our planet will support. And if you look at the growth in population and resource utilization in the last 100 years, it's been exponential compared to the previous 1,000 years, right? It's a log scale difference in terms of what we've been able to do. So yeah, I do worry about it. It doesn't keep me awake at night, but I'll be long gone. But it's, it is a concern. And obviously countries are thinking about it, China and India, where the populations are massive. And you see the effects of COVID, particularly in India these days, right? They have 1,000 deaths a day or something right now, but I don't know the solution to it at the moment. And
no, for sure. I just had to.
No, so the short answer would be, do I worry about it? Yes. Will it be a concern in the next 100 years? Yes, absolutely. Outside of, greenhouse gases and global warming and all of those things, is that, it'd be nice if we kind of stopped growing our total population, but I don't know how to do that. Trevor, thanks for your time.
I really appreciate it. Anywhere I can find a good doctor, any good recommendations?
Well, if you need it, so it used to be really hard to find a doc, but now it's pretty straightforward. So
online,
there's primary care networks that are established, and so if you just go into Google and say looking for family doc in X area, what'll pop up is the primary care network in the Hillhurst area, and there'll be scads of new docs taking new patients. Now, a young guy like you won't need a doc too often, but it is good to have a family doc for things that pop up. So I'm sure you can find one that way. So.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. This was high price time, and I really appreciate it.
Listen, you have a great winter, and get out and enjoy yourself, and say hi to your mom.
Thank you. Maybe we can do a part 2 in the new year.
Anytime. Take care.
Thank you. See you later. I'll just, one sec here.